Something about the Mustang just screams freedom every time they talk about it, and this one is absolutely no exception. The Shelby Mustang Supersnake is one of my personal favorite Mustangs of all time, and it's been upgraded from the GT500 to make an absolutely massive 750 horsepower, which is hands down the highest power output in the tier. Although, power isn't the only thing that matters in the super tier. In a world filled with lightweight rivals like Lamborghinis and Porsches that give it a great run for its money, it really needs to stand out to be worth using. So taking that into consideration, what is a Supersnake like? Immediately noticeable is that it's a bit difficult to drift, but not in the typical sense. It's just a bit different compared to the other cars in the tier. The Mustang isn't a very lightweight car to start, but with that massive engine taking up a good part of its weight distribution towards the front, it leaves it feeling a bit awkward to drift. Now, it's not the worst car in the tier for drifting, but it does leave it feeling a bit less responsive, and this is especially the case whenever it loses a good part of its speed in the middle of the drift. But it does, however, pick it back up very quickly, especially when paired with the nitrous. I don't want to say that this is especially a bad point for the Supersnake, but just compared to some other cars in the tier like the Panamera and the Gallardos of the tier, which can maintain their speeds very well through corners, it leaves the Supersnake feeling a bit slower than its competition. I've seen times where the Supersnake can enter a corner going around 170 and in the middle of its drift slow down to around 80 or 90 miles an hour, and I think that this is potentially a really big downside for it. Like I said, it does regain its speed very quickly, once again paired with nitrous, but it doesn't regain all of its speed, and I think this is where it loses a lot of its momentum. And this is especially important in more twisty places like in the mountains, showcased in one of its featured events. The Supersnake faces off against the Valentino Balboni edition of the Lamborghini Gallardo in a series of twists and turns. And I think this is a prime example of the Supersnake not quite being as effective as its competition. But I don't know if I want to say that the Valentino Balboni is the car's main rival, or any Lamborghini in general. I think the reasoning for this matchup is to showcase the Valentino Balboni's rear-wheel drive conversion compared to the rest of the Gallardos, which are all-wheel drive. But I don't really think that this is a fair comparison, especially when I'm looking at the list right now, as a matter of fact, seeing a very clear alternative to the Gallardo, and that is the Corvette, because they're both American, they're both solely rear-wheel drive, and I think that it's a much better comparison. But that's neither here nor there. Just for the sake of the duel, I'll quickly compare the Supersnake to the Valentino Balboni, and I'll just flat out say it, I don't think it cuts it against the Gallardo. The Gallardo's mid-engine layout helps it in more situations, especially in the drifting department, than the Mustang's front-engine layout. The Gallardo is also noticeably lighter than the Mustang, and that really shows in both acceleration and handling. Now, speaking of the Supersnake's acceleration, the 750 horsepower that it has definitely helps it accelerate quicker, but all that power going to the rear wheels means one thing: a lot of wheel spin, and boy does it ever. Off the line, I've seen the Supersnake wheel spin all the way until it reaches 4th gear. Only by that point, I would say, is when it starts getting solid, consistent gears without wheel spin. And I think this is a huge detriment to it, especially when a lot of the cars in the tier have all-wheel drive. The Gallardos, like I mentioned earlier, minus the Valentino Balboni, and even some Porsche models like the 959, the 918, and the Panamera all outdo it in acceleration just because they have all-wheel drive. Once it really gets going though, the Supersnake can be a fairly quick car, and I think its nitrous are actually a bit boosted compared to the rest of the tier, and it actually allows it to accelerate very quickly to its 200 mile an hour top speed. It's worth mentioning that with the turbo, that the Supersnake has a top speed of about 219 miles an hour. That definitely isn't the highest in the tier, because that goes to the 911 Speedster, see my video on that for more information, but I will say that it's on the higher end, and it's actually a very respectable car in terms of top speed. Now I want to touch on the Supersnake's availability, and here's where it gets odd. So, you do get the Supersnake relatively early in the tier, but the Super tier has so many specialized events for different cars, and by the way, the Supersnake doesn't really get one aside from the duel with the Valentino Balboni, that it often takes a back seat. And It's really unfortunate because I counted a grand total of 2 or 3 other events that you can use the Supersnake in, and it's really unfortunate because I think it's an interesting car in its own right. So, unless you use the Supersnake in an online lobby, which, by the way, probably won't happen often, it really won't see much use outside of those few events. I know it probably sounds like I'm making the Supersnake out to be a bad car, but that's really not what I'm going for. I think it really just takes a skilled player to bring out the best of it, and while I can say with pretty strong confidence that I can do it under most circumstances, it does stand that it is a bit more advanced than the other cars in the tier. One thing that I definitely will give the Supersnake credit for is its potential for hot pursuits, and I think the added weight that it has actually helps a lot in terms of taking extra damage from cops, and especially so dealing damage to them and other racers. So overall, with its massive power output, the Shelby Mustang Supersnake can be an effective car under the right situations. But its weight combined with its weird drifting physics prevents it from being effective in all situations. And even though this isn't especially a bad thing because I know each car has their specializations, it's really unfortunate that its limited usage can really prove its effectiveness. As we move on to the Supersnake Interceptor, a lot of this holds true, but with some added positives. The first thing I'll mention is the Interceptor's availability, and I think that this is hands down a net positive for it, because this can be used in so many more events as an Interceptor than the Racer version can. And I think this is really important, especially whenever it's a car in this game that should be used in multiple different events. Other than that though, it's largely the same, both positives and negatives. So the first thing I'll mention with that is the wheel span, and this is both better and worse, and I'm not quite sure how to explain this. Okay, so the Supersnake Interceptor still has the wheel spin, there is no denying that, but it gets going around the same time as the Racer version, so around 4th gear. But because of the added acceleration that cops have, it makes the wheel spin more severe, but after that 4th gear, it gets going pretty quickly. But through 1st and 3rd gear, it is more prone to spinning out because of that added wheel spin. The Supersnake finds itself to be overshadowed once again in the Rapid Deployment series, but thankfully there is a much clearer comparison in the tier. It's featured in a single event alongside the Viper in a Hot Pursuit, and you have the choice between it and the Viper, and anyone who I know who has played this game has opted to use the Viper instead. But that's not to say that the Supersnake is a bad interceptor at all. Even though there is no direct way to duel the interceptors of the game, which I wish was real by the way, I'll quickly compare the Supersnake to the Viper. So, the Supersnake still has that quirk where it loses a good part of its speed in the middle of sharp turns. And for that reason, I think the Viper is a bit better for rapid responses. However, if you can get a hold of the Supersnake's drifting physics and the added weight that makes it a bit less responsive when drifting, I think it can outperform the Viper in every other event besides rapid responses. Just like on the Racer side, I think it does take a really skilled player to bring out the best in the Supersnake Interceptor. But I think it can be a very capable interceptor in the right hands. But just because it doesn't have all-wheel drive like the Panamera and the other Gallardos, I think it does deserve to have some points docked for that as well. But I think this is one of those very few cases where it's more useful as an interceptor than as a racer. I'll once again bring up the interceptor's availability, and even though I talked about it earlier, I still think it should be highlighted because it's really important. The Rapid Deployment unit doesn't really have as many specialized events than the Super Series on the Racer side, and I think that this is hands down a really big advantage for it, especially whenever a lot of cars in the Super tier on the Racer side is locked to certain cars. The Rapid Deployment series has so many options available for every different event, and you at least have the Supersnake available if you wanted to use it. With that being said though, I'm not saying you should use the Supersnake for every single event it's available in, and I don't even think the Supersnake is going to be the most used car in the tier by any means. But it is nice having that option available. With so many Porsches and Lamborghinis in the tier, and even the Viper and Corvette seemingly overshadowing it, if you're looking for something different to use, it might be worth checking the Supersnake out. Even though it's not the most stellar car in the tier, if you're looking for practice with drifting or different handling physics, it can offer that and give you more experience in the game. I certainly wasn't expecting this car to turn out the way it did, and I even thought it was a bad car otherwise. Even though the Supersnake is one of my favorite Mustangs of all time, I still found myself using other cars just because it wasn't as effective. But honestly, I think it's pretty interesting in its own right. And like I said, even though it isn't the most stellar car of the tier, it definitely still has its niche as a unique car. Because of all that, I think it's worthy of a 6 out of 10 for overall usability, which might seem a little bit low, but there are so many other great cars in the Super and Rapid Deployment series that I think it is still a bit worse than the other cars in the tier overall. But I still think it is a very capable car in the right hands.